Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Philosophy for the People. We have a new face here today, but some of you might already know the name. Mike Schramm is somebody who has come on board over at my Substack as my associate editor, I guess is the position, right? And Mike's been helping me out with some cool stuff. He's been contributing. And we're going to have just a fun conversation here today on the podcast. We'll talk natural theology and stuff. But mostly, I want to introduce everybody to Mike for a couple of reasons. One is he's going to keep me on a better schedule with the podcast, hopefully, so we can get more regular content out over here, whether it's just the two of us having conversations about whatever philosophical topic is interesting or with other guests. So yeah, Mike, good to have you on here, man. And why don't you just take a minute, say a few words about yourself and all that good stuff.
Definitely. Well, yeah, thanks for having me. And I have been looking forward to just kind of getting to have more of these conversations. And, I had said to you, Pat, that I've been following Philosophy for the People for a while now. And I was probably one of those. I didn't reach out and start nagging you to have more episodes, but I did notice that the trickle of episodes had started to slow too. So it is kind of exciting to now get to be a contributor and be a part of that as well.
Yeah, and so my fault too, because just life gets busy, right? So and love the podcast. So it's kind of been nagging at me, like, oh man, was really good about getting out 1 to 2 episodes per week.
You didn't even need me to bother you about it. You didn't even need me.
It was nagging me. So it's good. It's good to have you here. And before we talk about whatever, I think we're going to rank arguments for God or something goofy and fun like that. Let's announce that kind of what we're doing over at the Substack, because it might not have totally filtered down through over here at the podcast. But so long story short, you can get paid to write philosophy if you're good. So what I did is maybe 2 months ago now or 3 months ago, I made the decision that I wanted to open up the Journal of Absolute Truth, my humbly named Substack, to guest contributions from other thinkers who kind of fit the mission of the journal. And we've had a number of really great contributors there already. We've been putting stuff out from Dr. Einrich Kerr, Dr. Jonathan Fuqua, Dr. Gavin Kerr, and we'll even pay you for it. And it's I think it's a good opportunity. If you're somebody who really wants to write philosophy and get it on a platform. It's not the biggest platform in the world, but we got a good little following, and it's growing, and it's increasing at an increasing rate, which is what we'd like to see. I would encourage you to consider it. We do have standards, so we have a whole page of guidelines of what we expect and stuff like that. But I want to just get the word out there about that. And Mike, I don't know, what am I forgetting? What else?
No. You put the if you're good in all caps and boldface, right? That's the important part. So no, like you said, who says philosophy isn't practical, right? Because as you are generously putting out there, we want it to be something that it's sort of like a you get what you pay for sort of mindset, where it's like we want the best stuff, and so we're encouraging, and that's part of the encouragement is saying, hey, we'll compensate you a little bit for kind of, I think of it as moving the needle forward, where, like you said, it's the Journal of Absolute Truth. We have that foundation or that thing to fall back on when it comes to classical theism, or whether it might be the truths of the Catholic faith, which we both ascribe to. But then providing that either some sort of unique philosophical angle, or even if it's just a really robust philosophical angle for that foundation, for that absolute truth that we're both kind of grounded in, right?
Yeah. So that's good. Let me be clear. You don't have to be a Catholic or even a classical theist to contribute, but you do have to fit the general kind of overall theme of the journal. And we have a page of different sort of submission guidelines. I'll link it below so people are clear on that. And you'll be emailing Mike, so don't bother me. I have nothing to do with this anymore. It's completely outsourced, so get on Mike's good side, because he will be the one who sort of decides your fate with all this stuff. So yeah. Okay. Anything else on that front? Anything else we should announce before we just jam around on whatever?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think didn't do a whole ton of background, but like you said, one of the most recent posts, I think it was maybe a week or two ago, we kind of had like a little bit of an introduction where I give a little bit of my background and that sort of thing too. So if anybody is interested in that side of it, you can go to the Journal of Absolute Truth, go to Substack, and you'll find it. So
And you not only have backgrounds in philosophy, but above all, you are a fellow Wisconsinite. So that's
yeah, there's maybe a little bit of an asterisk there. So technically, because I live on the border,
right.
so
Yep.
I do professionally. I'm a Wisconsinite, you could say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, good. Yeah. Good enough. All right. Awesome. All right. What's our theme today, Mike? What are we talking about?
So we're going to see. What's crazy is to me, there's only 5 arguments for God, but we're going to rank them, I guess.
We're gonna rank the arguments for God. Wow.
Rank them.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm probably going to be the stick in the mud because I'm going to try to like see how they all fit through the lens of Thomas Aquinas. But that's just, I think that's there's actually, I think, kind of an interesting angle to that, how he sort of is like all of these things in their simplest form. He kind of gives us that, which I think there's a lot to build off of. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself.
Yeah. So, well, you know what? Why don't you just start throwing stuff out there and we'll jam on it? Because there's like way too many different arguments for God, especially in the like wider literature today. Won't be able to get through them all, but let's
I think let's start with like probably one of the least technical, but I think the most accessible is the kind of the C.S. Lewis one, the argument like what is it called? Like from moral absolutes, basically, or I can't remember the exact how it was titled, but
general moral arguments.
And I think in some ways, like I said, probably the biggest appeal, besides the fact that it's presented by one of the most popular Christian writers in the last 100 years, is its accessibility. Because even people who struggle with like this moral issue or that moral issue, they still kind of find that grounding in, well, there's something that's right and wrong, right? I mean, that's still kind of the common sense approach. I know that it's undermined and people talk about moral relativism all the time, but it still is the common sense approach. And so like that I think can be sort of a good hook or a good foothold.
Yeah, it's interesting because this is something where I think I see a pretty big disparity. I think like on the popular level, and you see a sort of moral argument in Lewis's book, what is it, A Mere Christianity, right?
Yep.
And it tends to have a lot of pull with people, but on the professional level, it's like it's heavily like just straight up pooed on, right? It's just like right? Like most philosophers, I would say. I don't know. I haven't seen like a Phil Surveys thing on it anyways, but I would say it's got to be like certainly, obviously a majority of atheists don't go in for it, right? But I would be surprised even if most theists went in for like a successful moral argument.
Well, and I think part of it too is probably like you said, even the theist who might be in the kind of academic or professional setting, it's almost like you learn to play the game. And so some of these, like as I was kind of going through some of them, I could be like, well, I can see the value that this would have to somebody, but it wouldn't be something that like I would necessarily present because that maybe isn't the audience that I'm generally like speaking to, kind of working with. And so it could be one of those things too. I mean, like obviously we don't have the sociological data or whatever, but just kind of anecdotally.
Let me try and explain what I think is going on. A lot of times you get these kind of like simple statements of a moral argument. Like if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties don't exist. Something like of the sort that a Dr. Bill Craig would present, right? And then like to support it, you get a bunch of quotes from like nihilistic atheists, right? Talking about the cold indifference of the universe and Darwinian processes and why our moral beliefs are just programmed into us to procreate and avoid bears and stuff like that. And it's kind of presented in a way that there's this sort of logical space of alternatives that are exhausted just by a sort of nihilistic, morally anti-realist sort of atheism, right? A reductionist atheism, or like a theism that somehow secures the moral dimension in such a way that we can hold on to moral realism. And where like the professional philosophers come in is they say, well, hold on, there's a lot more logical space than just those two options, right? And that's where it gets a lot more complicated. Like, well, let's consider various forms of Platonism, or even if we, consider theism, you have to try to explain to us exactly how God is relevant to the moral domain. And I think a lot of theists, especially non-classical theists,
which is such a red herring anyway. But
don't have a particularly great story to tell. So I would say I'm generally not a fan of those sort of more simplistic moral arguments, but there's a book out. I heard it was very good, called The Best Argument for God. I don't know if you've
the
heard
best
of
one. Yeah. How did we not start with the best one?
Right. And you know, my approach here is just kind of a bit more modest, as I say, well, classical theism is part of a wider paradigm. It's sort of what anchors a wider paradigm that has a lot of resources to kind of give us that robust moral realism. And a moral realism is generally the view that there, you know, that there really are things that are right and wrong, good or bad, totally independent of our feelings or attitudes or preferences and stuff like that. It's called stance independence. And on this sort of broadly classically theistic worldview, one where you have essences and aims and teleology, and God is a sort of undirected director that you know puts the teleological arrow in and provides the telos or the good for things.
See, it's Thomas all the way down, Pat, is what you're telling me.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, man, you don't have to sell me on Thomism, right?
Yeah,
but I'm saying, but my argument at the end of the day is like, look, here's all the different things we want out of a robust moral realism. Seems like we can kind of get this from a classical theism, and there's other good reasons to endorse classical theism. If we look at all the other competing theories, I mean, some just are obviously anti-realist. So if you're trying to hold, and look, this does assume that people want to be moral realists, right? But if you're trying to hold on to moral realism, this theory is good. Other theories, not so much. You know, maybe they can secure a couple things that we want, but not all of them as well, and not in such a tightly unified sort of way. Or if they are explanatorily powerful, they don't cover as much in other domains, right? So there's a sort of cumulative case or systems approach that I like to take. So I'd rank that moral argument high. That's because that's the one that I give, but it's very different than the type of popular approach that.
And I would concur in that, like, even though the C.S. Lewis version is like I said, the more accessible or the more popular, I think what it's grounded in, you were kind of referring to like a teleology. So obviously that's Aquinas's fifth way, which, you know, that I would see as more persuasive as well. But then I think it also, you can relate it to Aquinas's fourth way of degrees of being, right? And this is one of the things that I try to emphasize a lot with my college students, is when we talk about, and it's a 300 level kind of intro to theology ish sort of or 300 level theology course. And when we go over the Christian morality / ethics, one of the things that I really want them to recognize is that the Christian morality or the rules, quote unquote, have this metaphysical grounding, that it's that, you know, these things are good because they participate in goodness itself, right? And so that's kind of the whole standards of being, where it's like we say this thing is good or that thing is good, this is beautiful or that's less beautiful, because there's this standard of beauty or this standard of goodness or standard of truth that they're participating in, and that's qualitatively different than this particular good action or this particular good thing. And that I think is much more persuasive. Now, when you can start with that baseline of we generally agree on these things are good and these things are bad, that can be a step stool, right?
Yes.
But that I think is still the much more persuasive kind of route to God. And like you said, if the person assumes a teleology, which not everybody does, then maybe Aquinas's fifth way is better. But it's like the moral argument, it's almost like it's like a tributary that comes off of a river, where it's like you have like the big 5 ways river, and then you have all these tributaries where it's like, well, it takes a little bit from the third way or a little bit from the fourth way, you know, a little bit from the fifth, whatever.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that, because the series that I'm running with Gavin Kerr over on my Substack right now, the way that we read the 5 ways are all themselves, you know, shoot offs from Aquinas's De Ente, right? Like his,
definitely
his fourth way of the various degrees is itself something that sort of, we argue the best way to read this is something that discloses the real distinction between essence and existence. And then from there, it sort of locks into his traditional De Ente cosmological argument, right? So,
and I think that touches on something that, I mean, I know this is, maybe it's been talked to death in certain Catholic philosophy circles, but how either non-Catholics, non-Christians, non-theists will kind of dump on Aquinas's 5 ways because they're simplistic. And what it's failing to recognize is that they're built off of these assumptions that he's sort of like, well, you've either done this or you already presume this. And part of that is, like you said, the essence and existence, which, that's a whole separate book that, or, document. It's only what, like 50 pages.
Treatise. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like that's a whole separate thing that he's assuming you are either just taking at face value or that you've read and that it's been kind of defended or whatever.
Yeah. Well, that sort of is a nice thing to maybe think about just Thomas's sort of package of arguments, is that sometimes they are objected to or dismissed because rightfully, it requires a particular metaphysical system or program to run it. And like, to me, that's a benefit, not a bug, because it's that sort of big tent Platonism. And, you said like, hey, the fourth way is kind of more Platonic or Neoplatonic. And I think that's right. I think, Aquinas kind of synthesizes the best of Neoplatonic and Aristotelian thought. So like, you see this at work throughout all of his work, right? Especially in De Ente. And what I want to say is that, so much of what is attractive to his metaphysical program for me is not that like you can run arguments for God. I mean, that's cool. And I think it is those arguments for God are what kind of gets to the source of the ultimate intelligibility of everything else. But how it solves problems in all other sorts of area, like morality that we're talking about, right? How to ground a moral realism, how to ground identity through time, how to make sense of change, how to deal with the one and the many, right? Like it's an extremely, extremely rich philosophical paradigm. How to ground real commonality or sameness that isn't strict identity with a real essentialism, stuff like that, right? So like it's already doing all this, I think, really robust and awesome philosophical work, which is good reason to endorse that system. And then if you think that lends it a good degree of plausibility, or maybe a little bit more than that, then yes, then you get some very, I think, quite robust, arguments for the existence of God as well. That also, because they're so, richly metaphysically embedded, can help give a fuller metaphysical picture of God, rather than these sort of kind of like isolated pop apologetics arguments you're not really sure like what to do with, And
and I don't know, maybe it's like a millennial thing, but we have this like aversion to arbitrary authority, or what at least is perceived as arbitrariness when it comes to certain claims. And so obviously we feel that most emotionally when it comes to moral claims, right? Where it's like, well, you're just imposing this on me. And when you can show that connection between the morality and the metaphysics, it's not actually making it cold. If anything, it's a unifying thing, because now it's not just like, well, I'm the power structure that's imposing it on you. This is actually something that not just all of humanity is grounded in, but like all of reality is grounded in once you kind of tie it into the metaphysics. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think that's again another benefit of I'll use these things like interchangeably, like Thomism, Big Tent Platonism. There's a school of thought here, perennial philosophy, that, and this might be old news to people who listen to this podcast, it is essentially like anti so much of modern philosophy, right? It's anti-mechanistic, anti-nominalist, anti-reductionist, anti-mechanistic, right? That's Big Tent Platonism. And the nice thing, to your point, Mike,
we're
is
both disciples of Ed Feser too. So that's not
and it really comes from somebody I know Ed is a fan of, but I'm a huge fan of, and that's Lloyd Gerson. His work is really, if there's like one book that anybody should read from him, just check out his Platonism and Naturalism, the Possibility of Philosophy. And he'll emphasize this too, but to your point though, is the nice thing about this Big Tent Platonism is it is a systematic whole, right? I mean, what we're doing in ethics and meta-ethics has deep metaphysical grounding, right? These are not independent research programs. Like, we need a way to show how all these things hang together. Coherence is an attractive feature of any particular paradigm. There's a high level of coherence within that paradigm. So I think that's an indicator of something good, right? So yeah, obviously we can't go into details of all these arguments because there's a lot of details in all the particular steps. But I will say Aquinas's sort of 5 ways, which you're right, Mike, are kind of mere summary statements of arguments he develops at length elsewhere, and are working off all sorts of assumptions that, to modern readers are just nowhere in sight, right? I think they're very powerful within that paradigm. And if people want to go a little bit deeper, then head over to the Substack, because we're now on like part 3, I think, of the series that I wrote with Dr. Gavin Kerr, where we introduce De Ante, help people get to kind of minimum effective metaphysics. And then now we're kind of just working through each of the 5 ways and kind of showing how to read them through the lens of De Ante. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I mean, there's some morality ones I was kind of paging through as well. So it's like you got a little bit of that on there too.
Is there? Yeah.
No.
I forget.
No.
I forget. Good. All right. What else we got?
Oh, well, I picked the last one. I thought you'd pick the next one.
Oh boy. Okay.
I can pick one that I didn't like if you want. I can pick one that I don't.
What do you have? Yeah.
So in the doc that we were kind of working through, I gave my bottom 5 in no particular order.
Okay.
The Watchmaker is like probably my least favorite. So let me see. Let me scroll down or the fine tuning. So that whole one.
Oh yeah, you don't like fine tuning. So I would be probably more sympathetic to fine tuning than you are. I don't have a whole lot much to say about the kind of Paley style Watchmaker arguments.
It just sometimes, I think so. I guess my biggest, and it's not even that it's like it's inherently flawed or it's not persuasive. Well, the non-persuasive part I think is that it's just overly complicated. And I think it overcomplicates itself, because what it does is it invites so much almost like non sequitur or red herrings into it that it can just become it becomes confusing for whether you're arguing for it or against it. Right. So it's like that's kind of, I guess, what I would say my biggest criticism.
Well, give an example. What do you mean?
So when usually the what I've seen when the fine tuning is kind of like presented in various ways, or at least appeals to it, is it becomes this like huge numbers game of like, well, what are the chances of this happening, of this detail being the way that it is, so that either life can exist or that oxygen stays in the atmosphere, or like all those sorts of and usually it's
the weight of the electron, so on and so forth.
Yeah. So whether it's and usually they're used in 2 directions. It's used in sort of like cosmology, like the creation, which technically, we would say is not. It's not even creation the way that we think about it, but it's usually used in that context, or it's used in the context of life, right? So it kind of for one, besides bringing in all of this extra detail of like a numbers game, which I don't think is necessary when you're having a kind of a metaphysical, when you're talking about a metaphysical subject, but it also can, unfortunately, like everything else, can become sort of politically charged just because of, the Big Bang Theory and the faith in science when it comes to creation. And then also the evolution, right? Because that's obviously when we're talking about the origin of life. So those are kind of and like I said, it's not even, it's partially about the argument, but I think it becomes too much of a distraction. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, I know. That's interesting. So I think it's important. I try to differentiate this in my book of different approaches to God, right? There's sort of different methodologies at play. And you strike me as a kind of traditional fellow, Mike, in your approach. And in many ways I am too, right? You do philosophy of nature, then you do metaphysics, and it's a bunch of carving reality at its joints, and you're trying to find the necessary conditions for things to exist or to be intelligible. And then eventually you get back to some ultimate fundamental self-explained explainer of everything. That's God, right? The pure actual prime mover.
That's why we love simplicity, or divine simplicity, so much.
Yeah. Whereas so a lot of what else goes on in contemporary philosophy of religion are these sort of paradigm comparisons, worldview comparisons, making use of like inference to the best explanation or what have you, right? Where they'll look at something like some feature of the world that presumably people of opposing paradigms agree upon, like fine tuning. There's some people who deny it, but it seems to have a pretty strong consensus behind it. So, if that's agreed on, then you say, well, what best explains fine tuning, or what worldview better anticipates, a world that has this sort of arrangement or setup or something like that. And that's the numbers are come in because they're supposed to show, the preposterous odds against it. Yeah. And the idea is, well, it's not so preposterous, obviously, if there's some sort of super thinking, super intellect is behind it and designing and setting things up and stuff like that. Right. And I think the advantage of us, whatever you want to think about an argument like that, I think you at least, and I think most people, even atheists, would grant, I know a lot of atheists have granted this, that like the surface level wow factor of the presentation of the fine tuning argument is really impressive, like on a general level, like the especially when a lot of those numbers are kind of trotted out, right?
Yeah.
Now, whether they actually can back up the major claim is, of course, much to the wider and deeper debate. With respect to evolution and watchmaker, because then people want to make biological design arguments. There's an issue of logical independence there. Like if you've already counted fine tuning, like in favor of the existence of God, like this raises your confidence in God's existence. Can you then go and count like biological complexity, or is that somehow already been taken care of with like once you have the physics set up? That's an interesting thing. Some people think they are independent enough that you could kind of cash in on both. Other people think no. Some people think you shouldn't even bother with the fine tuning. You should just look at arguments from biological complexity. So there's lots of. What's my stance on all of it? Well, I'm more sympathetic to fine tuning if you use that methodology that I'm talking about. I actually defend it in my book as part of a cumulative case. I don't have much to say about the watchmaker or arguments from biological design. It's just not an area I spend a whole lot of time on. I have hosted conversations on here with people like Michael Behe, who,
Sure. Yeah.
A lot of people put him in that family, like
they put him in that black box. I mean that, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So so where I'm maybe the most sympathetic is kind of to piggyback on what you were saying, where it's sort of like it lends itself to if you need to like show somebody teleology, right? And so maybe if you're operating with somebody who has this very mechanistic view of nature, of the universe or whatever, and then you need to start moving them in the direction of, well, actually, what if things are ordered towards something? And maybe this evidence shows you that things are ordered towards something, then you can sort of open up the avenue of teleology, and then you can maybe get them on what I think is a better track. So
yeah,
like I said, if that's where you're starting from, and like you said, there's that wow factor, if that's what it takes, then I obviously I'm like fine with it. But that's one of the things I, at least when I
see, I'm fine with it only if I think you can actually back it up substantially at the end of the day. Like I'm definitely against like throwing out some cheap argument you don't actually believe in just because it tends to have like a lot of persuasive appeal. And I'm sure you would agree with that, but I think sometimes people will do that, right? They'll throw something out because it's easy, it's accessible, it tends to impress people, but maybe at the end of the day, they don't actually think it's like all that super of an argument. You know what I mean?
Or yeah, you've just been swayed by the wow factor, but then that's all that's kind of there. So it's kind of like cotton candy. It just is like
yeah, and you don't want that. You don't want to like, because then somebody will like feel foolish, right?
Well, and it's like people can just, in the same way that in theology arguments, people can just throw Bible verses back and forth. People can always throw numbers back and forth too. So that's where it kind of becomes like a zero, like you don't really actually progress at all. But like I said, this is very kind of anecdotal. That's my experience, I guess.
Yeah, what are we ranking on? Like, there's different ways you can rank argument. I mean, the most important is like, do you think it's a good argument, right? Do you, right?
Yeah.
Is it valid? Does it, deliver a true conclusion through premises, which we can, which are really rationally decidable through the usual methods of philosophy? I think there are some, definitely, for sure. I think there's some good arguments. There's others that you might just think, okay, maybe it's not good, like to that level, but it's such that like it would warrant rational belief, right? Like maybe it doesn't, it's it's not like a totally demonstrative, and but it's enough that like if you went for it, it's enough to say you're not crazy. You know what I mean? And there's space for those types of considerations, right? So I think like people should afford themselves that sort of space when they're assessing things like this, because I don't know, there's a lot of arguments. Well, I know you have one on here. The Kalam argument, right?
Oh yeah, too basic.
Yeah, and well, I mean, it's just because an argument is stated in a basic way doesn't mean it's bad or something like that.
Sure.
But that's one where I'm honestly, there's so much going on right now in that debate, especially with like causal finitism and stuff like that, and I have not kept up. But like minimally, I want to say like, man, it just seems like even if you don't think it's like it ends the debate, it'd be hard to think that like you think somebody's stupid for going in for it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess like the and it's going to sound almost like snooty or whatever, but it almost seems like where it becomes just derivative of, and this is where I jokingly say, it's Aquinas all the way down or whatever, because it just it they all, I mean, they have persuade, like they're lasting for a reason. There's a reason why they're named after people, right? Like the Leibniz one, I mean, not just the Thomas one, but then you have the uh Malarian too, and was it Gobel? Sorry, I can't remember the name. The mathematician one, I can't remember. Godelian. So like
Oh, the
they're
ontological
so
argument.
it's like
Yeah.
they have lasting power, for at least a couple hundred years or sometime. So I mean, it sounds bad that I'm like dumping all over these, and it's like, who am I? But it's just one of those where it feels like if it, if somebody like needs that, and then to get them so far, but then I would say like, okay, but then here's where you can go, even further with it, when it's like it takes you to this point. So like the Watcher one takes you to that point where it's like, okay, now you can start to recognize teleology. Now let's actually take it even further. I think Kalam like takes you to the point of I mean, kind of like the first and second way, right? I mean, isn't that kind of the basic thrust of it? Is it's just sort of it's downstream from those largely, and it's like, so then just like take you to the first and second way, or take you to Aristotle's way of motion or something. So that's
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay. Yeah. So I kind of see what you're saying. I disagree a little bit. So I think that these are distinct for a couple of reasons. One is that Aquinas obviously pushed the first and second way, but he rejected the Kalam. So there's something going on here, right? There's got to be something different. And the reason being is like traditionally, historically, proponents of the Kalam thought that you could prove an absolute beginning to time, right? And this is something that Aquinas rejects. I mean, he holds that there was, an absolute beginning, but he holds that as a matter of faith, as a deposit in the matter of revelation, right? But he thinks that you can't philosophically demonstrate that, and people who, again, historically and even in more recent years, push the Kalam, they're trying to demonstrate that, and they either try to demonstrate it for one or two ways, or both. They try to either say, well, this is what science tells us, or something like that, right? Or more interesting, at least to my mind, because I'm not particularly equipped to adjudicate the scientific debates, is the philosophical attempts at demonstrating it, right? And there's a whole battery of arguments there, but the most recent have been these arguments for causal finitism, which is a thesis that no effect can be preceded by an infinite number of causes. So it would close down any sort of infinite causal regress, is kind of the idea. Aquinas doesn't want to do that, though. So Aquinas is totally okay with allowing infinite regresses of certain types of causal chains or causal series, particularly accidentally ordered causal series. He just thinks that there's a certain type of causal series, an essentially ordered causal series, or a series of like deep metaphysical dependence, where you have a real relation of deep dependence of some sort of quality or property that must terminate not in a temporally first member, but a primary member that has the thing sort of in virtue of what it is, or the power to
like
generate
the
it
second way, but then it starts to
right.
veer into it's relying on the third way now, because now you're talking contingent and necessary being, and so it's like it's still just sort of like I said, it's kind of downstream, because even if, like you said, you can prove that there's this like first thing, but it still relies on, even at that very moment, right? So like in the second way, it's all of existence at every moment is being held up by that, not primary in terms of chronology, but primary in terms of like hierarchy. But then that thing has to be necessary, not contingent. So there'd be nothing to say, even that first quote unquote thing in the Kalam cosmological argument, that could still be contingent, right? To go back to what you were saying about Aquinas and the eternity of the world, right? In that short little, that's only like 20-30 pages too. But on his eternity of the world is like, even if the universe is that kind of perpetually in motion thing, there'd still have to be a necessary thing under it, not at any point in time. It could be at this exact same moment, right? I think the analogy is like, there's the footprint in the sand, but then there's the boot making the footprint, and the one relies on the other. The print relies on the boot, but they still are happening at the same time.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So I just think I just think these are definitely different types of arguments. I think Aquinas is more robust metaphysically, and I think it's more significant as well in the sense that you have this sort of relation of deep dependence, a sort of, and it's synchronic, right? It's all here and now. There's this deep dependence relation. Whereas again, proponents of the Kalam, rather than looking vertically, are sort of looking horizontally, right, through a particular temporal chain of cause event relations that, essentially if it terminates, there's something that kicks it off, right? Now, whether that's incompatible, I don't think, the proponents of the Kalam want to say that that's incompatible with the sort of thing Aquinas is up to, but it's definitely a different approach, because Aquinas says that sort of causal reasoning you cannot demonstrate is necessarily terminating, but he thinks a sort of causal reasoning where he focuses on various, and each of the 5 ways kind of focus on a different feature or property, whether it's motion or efficient causality or contingency and necessity or grades of being or teleology. And he thinks in one way or another, these disclose a sort of deep dependence, relation that he thinks necessitates termination in a primary cause. So yeah, I think they're definitely different arguments. And I'm more sympathetic to those Thomistic ones than the Kalam ones, but I'm not as hostile to the Kalam argument as I think a lot of Thomists are. I
was probably just afraid to say it's too popular and I didn't like it. That's why. That's
the thing. Like you always want to be edgy, right? And like you see this all the time online. It's actually super annoying. Like if something gets too popular, you just got
all the Lane Craig bros are going to be after me now.
You just got to hate it, right? And then like that one guy starts getting edgy, and then everybody starts getting edgy because that's the popular thing. You just got to think, guys. You just got to think for yourselves, right? Like just like that's why you do.
Everyone do what Pat says and think for yourselves.
Just think, and like don't echo me either, right? You totally feel free to disagree with me. I'm taking a super safe position on the Kalam because I'm not like strongly. I think that there's if you look at the last I read on it was Proust's book on infinity and paradox, and I haven't kept up on the literature much from that, but he just makes a kind of cumulative case for the causal finitus thesis. He thinks that if you accept causal finitism, it solves a host of issues, and that's good reason to endorse it. And he thinks you can plug that in, you can kind of run the Kalam there. I know there's been just a lot of discussion, since then. I haven't kept up on it. So whatever sort of rating you think that gives it, I don't know. C. I don't know. I don't have my mind made up enough. That's the honest truth, right? Yeah. All right, Mike, you're on a time crunch. I know we don't have much more time. So yeah, yep.
I mean, I guess, since we're being edgy, I'll defend the Anselmian ontological argument, since as I said to you, it's not cool for a Thomist to like this one because Aquinas was critical of it. But I kind of have a soft spot for it. And like I said, I kind of see it as sort of a almost like a, I don't know, pseudo or proto variation of the third way, because it is kind of this idea where it's almost like it creates this sense of necessity, right? So I just very briefly, Anselm was like, well, greatest of all possible beings, and if it really was the greatest of all possible being, then it couldn't just exist in one's imagination, but would exist in reality. So if God's the greatest of all possible being, he'd have to exist not just in one's imagination, but in reality. I mean, to oversimplify, right? And what it does, though, is it gives this sense of contingent and necessity, right? And like we're all about trying to find that kind of divine simplicity, whittling things down, not being composite, but making things simple. And necessity is more simple than a contingent thing, right? Where there's no distinction between potentiality and actuality, or essence and existence. And so it's kind of a parallel. Maybe you want to say it's a loose parallel, but I think there's something there that I know that in recent couple of years, I thought there was sort of almost a not resurrection, but like a redemption that process of the Anselm ontological argument that you start to see. And like I said, maybe it's just one of those things where we're at the 20-year anniversary of the the prequel series, and now everybody likes Revenge of the Sith, even though everybody hated it back when we
I
were
went
in high
and
school.
saw it in theaters again. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
Still,
Everybody
it's
hated it
still
when
an
we were in high school.
objectively bad movie, but you get, I mean, you have
See,
the nostalgia.
all my
for it now.
students, though, all my students are too young for that nostalgia, and they all love it. They're
They
all like
still
talking about
loved
it.
it, even
But that's the
even
thing.
even the
They didn't
absolutely
grow up with all the hate.
horrible dialogue in that. I know, but I mean, just like
See,
sitting through the dialogue in
you'll
that
just
movie
see,
was so painful.
you'll
Yeah.
just see it as evidence that the culture is generally going downhill because the
Yeah.
young people like it.
Mhm.
But yeah, and we were just talking about it today because I was like, it's funny, I remember when they came out the first time and everybody hated them, and now
Right.
they're becoming this like not even cult classic, but like people are seeing it as like legitimate cinema. So
Yeah, well, it's
yeah.
not like this is a debate, but I'll let you have the last word on the arguments here. I will say this: so I'm generally skeptical of a lot of the sort of contemporary modal arguments. I remember even Flanagan, is kind of a champion of that. If I remember rightly, he said like, "Yeah, I don't think this proves God, but it can certainly make belief in God reasonable." He was pretty kind of modest. I will say though, Daniel Vecchio, a guy who I've partnered up with on some stuff, which reminds me to announce a few things before we go. He's been doing work on Anselm's argument. He was on the podcast maybe a year or so ago presenting it, and I just remember thinking, oh, okay, there's more to this than I initially thought, even though I had never really thought a whole lot about Anselm's version in particular. And I remember telling myself I need to look more into it because it seemed more promising in certain respects. So thanks for the reminder.
Anselm's wager, we'll call it. Yeah, it's
Wager.
worth doing, Pat. It's worth looking into.
Yeah.
So.
Well, speaking of, you brought up the Mullerian argument. So for people who want to read more philosophy, I have a few academic publications that are either already in print or will be coming out soon, but most of them you can find online. So I have an article with Nova et Vetera on the Mullerian cosmological argument. Obviously, I think that's a good one because I defend it in print. It's a very different sort of argument. It works from constituent ontology and essentially tries to argue that you get contradictory implications unless you bring in divine simplicity. So that's what that's up to. I have mentioned Daniel Vecchio. I have an article out with him in New Blackfriars where we're arguing there can be no successful logical problem of evil. And what we're arguing is that any sort of moral linking principle that could run a logical problem of evil is epistemically inaccessible. And I have another one that just was released as well in Theologica. And that's, I partnered up with Heinrich Gell for that one. And that is rebutting the modal collapse objection from contingent knowledge. For those who object that if God is simple, he can't, or immutable, he can't know contingent things. We argue that is incorrect. And we try to explain why. So people can check that out. I'll link it all below. Mike, this has been fun, man. I'm looking forward to doing more of these.
Yeah, same here. Appreciate it. Thanks, Pat.
Yeah. So guys, thanks for tuning in. Make sure you show Mike some love, make him feel comfortable around here, and let us know what you would like to see on the podcast. As we're kind of getting our production schedules together. If you have any ideas, any topics you want us to cover, drop a comment below, and we'll see if we can make it happen for you. See you guys.
Thanks. See ya.